for the east coast, and then as we move into next week, some more wet weather develops through parts of the south. So quite a wild week to come, but for now things are looking relatively settled. Maybe a shower or two around for Brisbane though. Tomorrow it's getting to 25 degrees, and after that some relatively clear skies. 24 for Sydney, a frosty start in Canberra, 21 to follow though. It's getting to 19 in Melbourne and Hobart, where we can expect a shower or two. 24 on the way for Adelaide. Perth, showers increasing for you. Could see anywhere from 6 to 15 millimetres. 25 will be the top, and up north, Darwin should have dried up with a mostly sunny day. It's getting to 33.
Nate, thank you. A reminder you can keep up to date at any time with all the latest news at news.abc.net.au and on iView as well. I'm Lorna Dunkley. Up next, the National Press Club. Shadow Minister for the NDIS, Bill Shorten, is speaking. Thanks for joining us this lunchtime.
Today at the National Press Club, the former Labor leader, now spokesman for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, Bill Shorten. Mr Shorten helped design the NDIS more than a decade ago. Now he argues the scheme is under threat. Bill Shorten with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club in Canberra. I'm Laura Tingle, the club's president. As we just heard, Bill Shorten's had a long career and a long association with the disability system, and we were just reflecting today at the club that it was 12 years ago that he gave a speech here as Parliamentary Secretary for Disability, which was a job that some people unkindly thought his leader had given to keep him busy, and he turned it into a really important policy area and became a major champion of the NDIS, which is an idea that came out originally from the 2020 summit. He's obviously had a lot of things on his plate since then, but he's back in this space and he's going to address us about the future of the scheme today. Please welcome Bill Shorten.
Thanks very much, Laura. First of all, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and a quick shout out to some of my parliamentary colleagues who are here, Dave Smith and Alicia Payne and Kimberly Kitching, a parliamentary secretary, and state opposition spokespeople on disabilities, Penny Sharp from New South Wales and Nat Cook. You know, in 2021, I think very few people would argue with the proposition that it is wrong to treat someone as lesser because of their race, religion, gender or sexual orientation. We've seen over the decades, particularly in the 20th century, all of these groups fighting for and claiming their civil rights. But how our society treats those with disability is also, at its core, a civil rights issue. And that, at heart, was the basis of Labor creating the National Disability Insurance Scheme. As we work with the disability grassroots to bring the NDIS into being, our position was this: the disability experience should no longer be relegated to the shadows. It should not be a matter of misplaced stigma or shame. The disability experience is just part of the broader mainstream experience. You might not be one of many people born with a disability, but you might develop a disability in early or a later life. You might acquire disability suddenly through an accident or a medical event like a stroke. If this happens to you, or to a friend, or to a parent, or to a loved child, suddenly the disability experience in Australia is very real and present. It is, in short, a mainstream matter. And the NDIS treats it as such. But today, my hypothesis is that the promise of the NDIS is being betrayed. Not yet fatally, but certainly substantially. The great tragedy of this has been the timing, to which I will return. I still remember my rude awakening after being elected to Parliament at the end of 2007 as Junior Minister for Disabilities. as witnessing the second-class lives endured by Australians with disability and the people who loved them and cared for them. I quickly recognised there was a major gap in Australia's health and disability safety net. I began to champion what is now the NDIS and to support people with a disability and to actually protect all Australians. As Parliamentary Secretary for Disabilities, I, along with Jenny Macklin, Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, with many grassroots campaigners, disability service providers, carers and advocates, we all worked together to design the scheme and to get the NDIS Act passed in 2013. I'd like to give a special acknowledgement to Doogie Hurd, not only the best Scotsman since Braveheart, but one of the early champions of the scheme from the disability community. The creation of the NDIS was a last volley from an era of big public ideas. I believe it is difficult to name another reform of this scale proposed, let alone achieved, since then. Too often, political endeavour is the field of failed dreams. Politics is strewn with the good intentions of good people, from the left and from the right, but all too often little is accomplished. The NDIS is the exception to this in the last decade. Today, the NDIS stands as a great reform because it provides support to people with severe and permanent disabilities based upon their individual needs. Today, there are 430,000 NDIS participants, 212,000 of whom are receiving supports for the first time. Today, as a result of Labor's vision and foresight, the NDIS now stands alongside Medicare as a key foundation of a fair and decent society. Like Medicare, the NDIS is a universal insurance scheme. It promises if you or your child or your grandchild is born with or acquires a disability, then the NDIS will be there to provide tailored support based on individual needs. Medicare looks after you when you're sick, but the NDIS is there when the condition is permanent. The NDIS could have only been created by a Labor government. And as we are discovering, it can only be run properly by a Labor government. In fact, we are learning in real time that expecting a Liberal government to properly manage a scheme like the NDIS is a bit like expecting a duck to be able to play a Stradivarius violin. If you study your political history, you see it. It is the parties of Labor and Social Democrats who deliver the big nation-building projects, the civilising institutions, the parties of the great generous safety nets that raise us all up and protect our people from entropy and destitution. In Australia, it is only Labor who could have given us the minimum wage, Medicare, superannuation and the NDIS. And despite the Australian people's fondness for these achievements, the Liberal Party's ideological war against the generous safety net never sleeps. So the tragedy of the NDIS, as I've said, is in its timing. We passed the legislation in 2013. Labor lost government the same year. And it has been the Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison show ever since. So what we got at the birth of this great, unique, world-beating national disability scheme, and in its infancy at the time when it needed to be cared for, nurtured and rolled out across Australia, has been a bad babysitter in the form of successive Liberal governments that were at best ambivalent about the scheme and too often hostile to its existence since. Now, we had hoped we would be in power to roll out the scheme, to react to the unforeseen consequences in this bold national endeavour and to improve it wherever necessary. Instead, the NDIS has been chaperoned by the cavalier vandalism of successive Liberal governments. After 8 years of neglect and 7 different ministers for disability, I am sorry to say that the ongoing existence of the scheme as we dreamed it to be is at risk. Under the Morrison Government, it is presently at risk from neglect and worse, direct attack. Initially, we secured for the invisible people of Australia, people with disability and carers, a reasonable degree of bipartisanship from the Abbott opposition. But the current government, because it wasn't actually their idea, they simply don't believe in its proper maintenance. It is sadly not overstating things to say that in 2021, the NDIS has the front door padlocked to the genuinely needy, but the back door is wide open for crooks and profiteers. Sadly, it is not overstating things in 2021 to say that NDIS participants are dying in their homes due to agency neglect and a sleepy watchdog that has not properly been put to work. It is not overstating things to say that those in charge at a ministerial and agency level have been more concerned with data points than people, that they are too secretive, that there is too much of a closed shop, a black box dealing with the key numbers and evidence, and this approach is killing trust. It is not too much to say that they are in a mad rush to trade a vital public service for a human-free robo-system, and to do so regardless of the damage and seemingly at too high a price. Let us consider this ideological zeal, for instance, and how the controversial compulsory ind-assessments plan has come about. First step, what are independent compulsory assessments? The Morrison Government want 430,000 plus Australian participants who've already proven, supported by expert medical and allied health professional advice and lived experience, that they are sufficiently disabled to be on the NDIS. They want these people to prove it all again, to reapply, to try to requalify for a scheme under their new guidelines. It is privatisation by stealth. Now, there are several glaring problems with this. The so-called independent assessments are not independent at all. They are robo-planning from the government who brought us robo-debt. And as with robo-debt, robo-planning is based on flawed mathematical algorithms. There is no evidence that independent compulsory assessments are a great idea. It has been constructed in a black box. And the disability community fear it and detest it legitimately. I mean, so how do you steamroll in such a thing? A thing that no one wants, a thing that lacks sense. Well, what the Liberals have done here is a masterclass in scruples-free governing. Here is their guide to steamrolling in unwanted changes. First of all, hold one rushed sham pilot and one incomplete pilot scheme. Then report back before even that pilot is finished. They were a raging success and everyone loves the new proposed system. This part of the Liberal plan hit a bit of a brick wall when Labor was able to reveal the radical changes for more than 400,000 Australians on the NDIS was based on a pilot involving fewer than 40 actual NDIS participants. So now, what do? Let's have a new pilot scheme. But it is clear that the Morrison government intend that they know the answer to what it's to be because they've already signed the contracts with their mates in big consultancy to roll out a new system. Why are they signing the contracts if they... why are they having the second trial if they've already given the contracts for the assessment? Now, in fairness, this was all under the reign of the 6th Minister for Disability, Stuart Robert, not the current Minister. The next step in scruples-free government is to get an independent review of what needs to be done to improve the NDIS and hope that your plan miraculously appears for compulsory assessments. But when it comes back and it doesn't include what you wanted in it, as the government did, why not just write in the part of the report you want? Independence be damned, it's just a marketing term. And then when the supposedly independent report comes out, let's go through the whole kabuki theatre performance of welcoming its call for, guess what, miraculously independent assessments, as if it wasn't your plan from the very start. It would be a joke, except it's actually happened. In the push for compulsory assessments, there are no grassroots. It is all astroturf. There isn't a single organic particle or participant call for compulsory testing. Australians with disability have said to all of the political class, they've said no, no, no to compulsory assessments. Yet, when it comes to compulsory assessments, Minister Rendell still has the motor idling on Minister Roberts' steamroller. Much of the vandalism perpetrated on the NDIS by the Liberals is done in the name of scheme sustainability. Now that whistleblowers and journalists have dragged into light the full ugliness of the secret plot against the NDIS, from the fabricating process to creating razor gangs, I predict we're going to hear a lot more about scheme sustainability. I ask you not to fall for it. I ask you to remember a few key salient facts. Firstly, this government has been responsible for the NDIS for almost 8 years. This is the government who always boast about what economic supermen they are. Yet leaked internal documents from the government to NDIS staff reveal their ramshackle management. I quote, "At the moment, the costs of the scheme are increasing at a much higher rate than we've expected because we've been building budgets based on inconsistent information and decision-making." Whose inconsistent information? Whose decision-making? Their own. But let's not forget that Scott Morrison stole $4.6 billion from the scheme before the last election, a so-called underspend, while Australians with disability were begging for wheelchairs and home modifications and autism therapies. Let's call it what it was. 2-3 years ago, $4.6 billion cuts to disability to fund a back-in-black budget that's never come. So according to the Liberals, participant expenditure is going through the roof. Sustainability is teetering, and at the same time there are multi-billion-dollar underspends. Pick your poison, government. It can't be that you have an underspend and you can rob the NDIS, or on the other hand, you're spending too much and therefore we must rob the NDIS. The reality is, if you cook the books, if you treat disability funding as an ATM and rip out money for political purposes, I'm not sure you then get to play Chicken Little and say the fiscal sky is falling. You certainly don't get to do it and be believed. That would be like running debt and deficit fear campaigns every year in every election and then presiding over $1 trillion debt ceiling, but being able to say, well, it doesn't matter anymore because we did it. Nevertheless, let me be clear. We in Labor are always up for finding sensible efficiencies. A scheme run for purpose. So let's start with first principles. If you run a small business, say a milk bar, then shoplifting can be the difference between profit and loss. There is a reason why small shops often have large signs warning shoplifters will be prosecuted. So now, let's say you run a $22 billion a year public service organisation, and networks of organised criminals regularly, routinely siphon off millions and millions of dollars from the scheme. I think perhaps that's a pretty good place to start making savings. You could even say hiring more fraud investigators would be a decision that more than pays for itself. John Jock Higgins was an ex-AFP officer for many years who then worked as a senior fraud investigator at the NDIA before leaving due to frustration at understaffing and dysfunction. Last year, this brave whistleblower described to me just how easy it was for these gangs to defraud money from the disabled and from the scheme. He said that the agency unofficially accepted a 10% fraud rate. He revealed that when money was stolen from disabled people's accounts, little effort was made to recover it from the criminals. The amount of the stolen funds was simply reimbursed to the participant's account, which is a double slug to the taxpayer. The agency, meanwhile, still refuses to tell journalists how many investigators it has on staff and how much is lost to fraud each year. So there are plenty of places that efficiencies can be made in the NDIS without hurting people with disability. Here's another one. Big consultancy cronyism and a stultifying staffing cap saw the agency spend more than $250 million on consultants and contract staff in 2019. In 2020, they spent $17 million on legal costs, including expensive private lawyers to stare down civilians with disability representing themselves and who usually win at the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. Alas, when the money needs saving in the NDIS, the Morrison government look at the lawyer, the consultant, the crook and the person in the wheelchair. And you know who they squeeze each time. But even more seriously, the neglect, the lack of care and the lack of thought, the lack of priority for Australians with disability isn't just some abstract bureaucratic Labor versus Liberal complaint. It has real-world consequences. NDIS participants are literally dying of neglect in their own homes. At the moment, the oversight of the failure of care in the system is simply not good enough. Imagine an episode of Bondi Rescue on a day where there's a lot of tourists and a lot of rips, but where the lifeguard is a mannequin. And so we have Anne-Marie Smith, constrained to a wicker chair, left to rot in an Adelaide home in terrible circumstances. Sydney man David Harris, battling schizophrenia, missed a meeting, and so the agency unilaterally cut off his supports, meaning cleaners did not attend his house. So he died alone. It was up to 2 months before he was found. Cairns man Liam Danherd, 23. He needed a high-tech mattress to alert his parents or carers if he was having a seizure. 3 different medical experts confirmed and approved it. The NDIA rejected it. In October last year, his family appealed to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, but Liam died alone in the middle of the night with his devoted parents sleeping next door, still waiting in the face of the recalcitrance of the disability authorities. He died from a seizure that his family say would have been prevented by the mattress that they were begging and fighting for. And what worries me is that today, in places around Australia, there'll be more of these heart-rending stories that we just simply aren't identifying. Too many stories of misery inflicted by a system that's failing the people it was meant to help. Too often in the aftermath, all we hear are Liberal MPs saying the right things, the proper words of solace and respect and belated regret. But in the 13 years working alongside people with disability, I've learned a long time ago that the right words, the proper emotions, that's the easy bit. It is easy to recognise an individual tragedy, to acknowledge the sadness of a particular case. The real test, though, of sincerity, the real test of giving a damn, the real measure of your commitment to the cause, the real value you can bring as a government or as an alternative government is action. There is much that needs fixing in the NDIS. Workforce shortages, red tape for providers, delay in payment of invoices, more effort on pre-planning, thin markets, particularly in regions. We need a domestic violence strategy which the NDIA can pick up on. Services for our first Australians, the reduction of red tape for small business. Specialist disability accommodation, or SDA in particular, it needs reform. The authorities are making it so hard for participants to access SDA housing, it threatens to become, in effect, a return to the bad old days of group homes. In the SDA, the Specialist Disability Accommodation area, it's becoming a dog's breakfast. The vast majority of housing expenditures going into existing housing, not new facilities with amenity and a link to meaningful community engagement. Labor's saying the agency needs to run the scheme as a market steward and leader, not just delegating all problems to the market. The NDIS right now is not well run. It is under attack and Australians with disability are suffering. Now that is the bad news. But despite all of this, I am an optimist. I like to be in the solutions business. So how do we protect the scheme and revive it and bring it back to its original promise? And here and now I acknowledge the thousands of people in disability working every day to do the very best they can. But what would an Albanese Labor government do to save and revive our nation's NDIS? Well, to the 4.4 million Australians who self-report with a disability, and to the millions who love and care for them, I say this is what you can expect from us. You will once again be listened to. The voice of participants, the voice of disability, was instrumental and irreplaceable in creating the NDIS. Under a Labor government, that voice will be instrumental and irreplaceable in reviving and protecting the disability safety net. Those currently in charge of the scheme see people with disability as numbers on a page, data in a system, a cost to be reduced. We see it as a thriving, resilient, mainstream part of the Australian community who actually know their experience better than anyone. We see the whole person, not just the impairment. That is why we will return people with a lived disability experience to the board of the agency and to the senior levels of the National Disability Insurance Agency. We will strengthen the Independent Advisory Council and reference groups advising the NDIS board, not just with the added involvement of people with disability, but with carers, with disability workers and their unions, with people with a strong business background. We don't view providers as the enemy, and we have no problem with carers getting respite. So rather than continue the Liberals' war of attrition against advocates, we would better fund independent advocates who would help people navigate the scheme. We will strengthen the disability watchdog and put it to work. We say no more NDIS participants should die through neglect, in abandoned squalor or due to bureaucratic indifference. We'll empower staff and investigators to get back through the backlog, to proactively check and investigate the treatment of people with disability, not just to wait for the complaints to come in, or even worse, for the flashing blue lights of police and the arrival of the coroner's van. And we will listen to the states and territories. When nearly every state and territory disability minister, including those in state Liberal governments, are furious about being excluded from secret federal disability plans, you know you have a problem. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it is that sometimes the states and territories can do things better than the feds, and certainly our nation does better when all levels of government are pulling in the same direction. We would return the scheme to what it was in the beginning, a genuine cooperative federal partnership. And in return, we would expect the states not to vacate areas of disability services that they retain responsibility for. Any significant changes to the scheme we will do by legislation and let the Parliament decide. The current minister wants a so-called God power to change the scheme unilaterally. The unwritten attitude is stuff the states and stuff people with disability, we know best. We won't do that. We'll find efficiencies, but not through secret cost-cutting programs designed by expensive consultants. Instead, we want to encourage service providers, people with disability and carers to share their best ideas on how efficiency in the scheme can be increased. At the heart of this will be a transparent website hosted by the agency as an open marketplace of ideas and proposals for improved efficiency. We'll introduce greater accountability of how money is spent in the NDIA and the NDIS. And we'll also bring about accountability for outcomes for participants in the scheme. Accountability is a two-way street, not just the participants to the agency, but the agency to the participants. We want a professional service. We want deadlines. When a participant seeks an answer from the agency, you shouldn't wait weeks and months. We want to make sure that when the disability agency makes a decision, that they talk to the watchdog before they roll it out. And instead of slashing support for vulnerable people with disability and treating them like potential routers and cheats, we'll save money by pursuing the real crooks, the lone wolf fraudsters, the organised criminal networks. Too often under the Morrison government, it is easier for the fraudster to defraud the scheme than it is for a person with a profound disability to gain access to it. This stops. We'll reinvest any genuine underspends into the NDIS to secure the long-term financial future of the scheme. We will lift the cap on public servants in the NDIA and develop a coherent workforce strategy to engage the sector in partnership with people with disability, families, educations, the higher education sector, providers, workers and their reps. Let's invest in better trained, directly employed permanent Commonwealth staff rather than rely on boiler rooms of labour hire contractors. We'll create an agency review of the supported independent living process so participants are not left waiting for housing for months and years, and develop a seamless timeline. This is a plan. These are our design principles. It's a plan for a vibrant, functional NDIS from the people who created it. I don't expect the Liberals to embrace it or enact it, but of course they're welcome to. There are a few things, though, this government should do immediately if it wants to restore some trust, some form of relationship with the disability community. There are things that Minister Reynolds must do if she wants Australia to believe she's not simply there to continue Stuart Roberts' work of demolishing and privatising the NDIS. Now, she's got a very easy act to follow, but her test can't be that. It can't just be that she's not as bad as Stuart Robert. This is Minister Reynolds' chance at political redemption. There are 5 benchmarks she should meet. 1, just cancel the contracts for compulsory assessments. I mean, as we know, the government signed contracts with 8 companies worth $500 million. But the plan for compulsory assessments is apparently on hold until a test comes back and says, should we go ahead? It's in a state of flux and constantly changing. Indeed, earlier this month, the government's disability legislation was leaked. They didn't want to release the exposure draft, so we did. And since then, we've seen them walking back some of the uglier parts. So how do we know, though, if they have the right contractors for the job? We just don't. They put the cart before the horse. And now Ms Reynolds should do the right thing and just tear it up. Tear up the contracts, get the best deal for the taxpayer, not just quietly pay out nearly $500 million to corporates for sit-down money. 2, she should just scrap the mandatory assessments plan in its current form. Just go back to the drawing board. The plan has been tainted, compromised by the chicanery of its origins. The sham pilot, followed by the sham supposedly independent review that the government was in its neck, up to its neck. Now, I actually have some sympathy for Minister Reynolds here, as these were likely the creation of the ham-fisted predecessor, the Prime Minister's bestie, Stuart Robert. But if Minister Reynolds pushes on with this dodgy plan, then she is no better than Minister Robert. Now, there are ways to make the scheme more consistent and equitable that can be found by genuinely consulting with participants, families, providers, workers, advocates. Listen, the third thing she should do is just come clean on her secret NDIS razor gang and just call it off. The Australian public only learned of the government's instructions to agency staff to slow growth in the number of people joining the scheme and to slow funding because of another whistleblower leak from the agency. This is not transparent. It is not transparent governing, it's sneaky theft from the disability portfolio. The Minister must clarify the role of this razor gang, which is euphemistically called a Sustainability Action Task Force. So the other 2 things she should do is she must publish the number of in-house fraud investigators keeping criminals away from the NDIS. Ripping off disabled people is simply despicable. And finally, she could detail her plan to stop further preventable deaths of Australians on the NDIS. Now, there's a lot more that she could do than this, but I think if she meets these 5 basic benchmarks, then people with disability know that they're not being targeted and that they've got a champion for people with disability, and there's no plan to dismantle the NDIS. Anyway, we'll see if she does this. I often think, in conclusion, of that beautiful description of the goal or the purpose of the Labor Party as being the light on the hill. The light on the hill, it is something, it's out there. It's not immediately within the grasp. It is something that we strive towards. We often use symbols of lights or flame when it comes to things that are abstract but precious. These things are vulnerable. The light can go dark. The flame can be extinguished by cold winters. If the fire is not tended, if it's not fed and maintained, it will just go out. It requires a difficult bringing into being, and then it requires constant protection. When we achieve good things for society, they become concrete and obvious, accepted and non-controversial. But before they are achieved, they can be hard to grasp, ethereal, easily attacked. The immense promise of the NDIS is still there. It has literally, in the last 10 years, lifted hundreds of thousands of Australians with disability out of conditions of misery and despair. It has lifted them out of a second-class exile in their own country. The flame of the NDIS still burns. But at this moment, like no other in the past decade, it needs protecting. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Mr. Shorten. I suppose if we could start with a couple of things about protecting the NDIS. A lot of people are very concerned about the independent assessment scheme that's been proposed. So my first question is, what can Labor do or the Parliament do to stop that happening? Is that possible? And second, you've said that you want to take the NDIS back to where it was supposed to be when it was first envisaged. But of course, it morphed quite a lot from the initial proposals to even to 2013 when the legislation came in. So exactly where do you want to take it back to? And overall, do you think this would involve a net increase in spending or basically the same envelope of money? Or do you think that there are actually net savings to be had by the sorts of proposals you've laid out today?
Thanks, Laura. First of all, how do we defeat independent assessments? I think we're winning that fight right now. We win it by being a strong opposition, by the grassroots of disability, taking an interest, understanding it is not Mr Morrison's NDIS, it is the people's NDIS. The government has legislation, which we were able to get from a whistleblower, which showed some of the thinking behind it, and they've shelved that for the time being. But I think this will be a job for the Senate, so I'll call upon the crossbenchers to carefully listen to the disability groups and advocates in their seats. And also, what we've done is suggested for Minister Reynolds today some things she could do to help re-win trust in the sector. But it's and they should cancel the contracts, for example. It's fundamentally an ill-conceived idea asking 433,000 participants to re-interview and prove their disability yet again. Just think about it. Imagine if you had a child, an adult child, and you've spent years in the system, and then the NDIS comes along and you've finally got your package, then imagine the anxiety that you're going to have to all explain it all again, that apparently to someone who's going to interview your child for an hour or 2 hours and make a decision, which could mean you're just like the game of snakes and ladders, you go right back to the start. So I think there's legitimate outrage out there. Also, getting the independent assessments done by a whole lot of large providers is the privatisation of the system. I am sceptical that the NDIS wouldn't then use the cost of the assessors and take it out of people's packages. So it's a fight. But so far, half-time, I feel we're ahead, but we've got a long way to go. In terms of what it should be, let's just go back to first principles here. You know, I've said that Medicare and NDIS are similar, but really when you think about it, we all sign up to Medicare because all of us use it. But when you think about NDIS, what a remarkable compliment it is to the Australian people. Because whilst disability can affect any of us, the reality is that many people won't need it. But what a great and generous society Australians are. This is unique in the world. We are a people, proud in our own identity, who decided that we regard as a society the empowerment of people with disability, which is a smaller group, we just said we'll all pay for it. This is a great reflection on the Australian people. This has been an impossible dream. Whitlam looked at it. It's been spoken about in the past. In the time of Rudd and Gillard, Labor digested the idea, the party backed it, the government backed it, and we got bipartisan support for the start of it. But I think the Australian people want it run, you know, to fund efficiently, and that is not being run efficiently. Now, some of those examples and numbers I give, it's not efficient. So we want to return it to efficiency and purpose. That's our vision. In terms of where will it ultimately be with the cost and whatnot, it's a bit... I tell you what I don't want. I don't want disability to have cuts and cuts and cuts and we end up like aged care in 10 years' time, because that's what happened to aged care. We've got a scheme. Let's hang on to it. We can run it more efficiency. You could do more with pre-planning with disability support organisations. Rather than trying to test the functional assessment of a person and make that the holy grail, maybe there's a role for some forms of assessment. But why don't give the tests to the treating health professionals, allied health professionals, rather than getting some random stranger in? Because really what the government's saying is, we don't trust the physios currently looking after you. We don't trust the OTs looking after you. We don't trust the speech pathologists looking after you. We don't trust the current people, so we want to get someone new. So I think efficiency, I think return it to purpose. The Australian people want this. And as for spending in the long run, if you don't give funding to a person with a disability and you put them into a state of crisis, you'll pay 10 times as much when they're in a hospital bed or when they're a young person in inappropriate accommodation. You'll pay 10 times as much in crisis, in hotels and expensive accommodation not fit for purpose. In the long run, I have no doubt the cost of disability can decrease per person, but we do it by actually empowering people, giving people choice and control in their lives. And of course, the final thing I'd say on this, Laura, is the NDIS shouldn't be regarded as the oasis in the desert, and the game is to get the NDIS. Let's have a national disability strategy. Let's include people with disability in all of our mainstream decision making.
Next question is from David Crowe.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Mr. Shorten. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Your criticisms of independent assessments are very clear, and I wanted to raise with you a comment by one of the founding board members of the NDIS, John Walsh, the other day. I'm sure you're familiar with what he's argued. He from what I can see, he is supporting independent assessments as reasonable and necessary. But what I really want your thoughts on is the cost estimate that he's raised, that without this independent assessment or some sort of check on the expenditure, the NDIS cost would go to $50 billion a year rather than a $20 billion a year scheme. I'm interested in your thoughts on whether those cost estimates are realistic and therefore whether there's got to be some sort of assessment in order to limit the expense.
Listen, I like John. I got him to be work as the Associate Commissioner on the Productivity Commission. I picked him, so I rate him. He's a very clever man, and I spoke to him yesterday in anticipation of your question today, not knowing that you would ask it, but nonetheless. Listen, I don't accept that number, and I don't accept that what the government's doing is actually what John Walsh was talking about. I mean, first of all, there's already assessments. Like, you don't just bowl up to the NDIS and say, "Hi, I'm here, give me a package of money." What I don't accept is that every person already in the scheme should have to re-interview to be in the scheme. Can I put it really bluntly? If you're blind, you're still blind. If you're deaf, you're still deaf. If you've got autism, you still have autism. What the NDIS is meant to be about is looking at people's goals and ideas. It's an individualised package. The fact of the matter is this government, in my opinion, wants to scrub certain categories of disability, and I've read it in their exposure draft: acquired brain injury, fetal alcohol syndrome. And you just won't convince me that they don't think there's too many claims related to autism going into the scheme. But they won't actually say that. This is a cookie-cutter system where they've got an algorithm, which they won't share with us, where miraculously, whatever the assessment, you get the same sort of package. So I don't trust the government. So do I think that there's a role for assessment? Yes. But do I think that a random stranger whose numbers then become, I think, disproportionately important in the decision is the way to go? No, I don't. Do I think hundreds of thousands of people with disability and their carers are sick and tired of having to prove that their kid or their family member is disabled? Yes, I do. And so I don't trust them. And by the way, why do they spend so much time on lawyers fighting on decisions? Why do they use so many consultants? Why do they have a nonsense staff cap? The reason why they have a staff cap is they want to pretend they're not hiring more public servants. So instead they'll pay more money to labour hire. It's a fiction. Can't we stop the fairy tales in politics? So I think that there is a role for functional assessment, but not the way this government's doing. I don't trust them. I think all they want to do is create a cookie-cutter scheme, fit everyone in, and that's the problem.
Laura, can I try a second question? Because it's a follow-up to your question.
Madam President.
Look, it's just a basic one. Is it clear yet whether in your objections to independent assessments you can stop that on the floor of the Parliament? Is it clear yet whether they need a change to the law to enable this change to the assessments, or whether it can be done without a bill, without a vote in the Senate?
It's pretty funny, isn't it? If this government could avoid going to Parliament, they would. These guys have got the, they've got the God complex about their decision making. They don't want to go to Parliament, yet they had to prepare exposure draft legislation. So if they try and bring these changes in without going to Parliament, then they'll have an almighty legal battle. So I think they can't avoid the Parliament, which annoys them no end. So it'll be up to the crossbench. It's by no means clear we can stop the government, but it is completely clear that I'll do everything I can to stop the government.
Next question is from Tom McElroy.
Thanks for your speech, Mr Shorten. Tom McElroy from the Financial Review. Felt a little bit like old times there for a while. Good speech. Last night the Health Department was unable to give an updated figure on the number of vaccinations among residential disability care residents. The figure they had was 1,640. It was a week old. Yeah. Could we have your assessment of the rollout for people in the NDIS and the disability community more broadly? And if I may have a second question as well, a poll last week put Labor's primary vote at 33%, similar levels to 2019. What does that say about the party's standing if we're a year from an election?
Was the poll in your paper, Tom?
No.
Okay, well, do you? Okay.
It was in David's paper.
Very good of you to have cross-publicised someone else. Listen, just going to the first question of vaccinations, this is why vaccinations is important for people with disability. COVID for us here is over a fair bit. We're all here, we're gathered together. But for people with disability, they are more susceptible in many cases, considering their impairment, their immunities are compromised. They're still trapped in their houses. COVID hasn't ended, friends. That's why people with disability in houses should be vaccinated. That's why their workers should be vaccinated, because they're not out of COVID yet. It's scary. And so that's why I think this government should be vaccinating people with disability in group homes, as they promised to do. I mean, by the way, what's the current exchange rate for a Scott Morrison promise in this country? It's got to be depreciating. Like, he promised. Like, this guy is so good that even when he promises, we don't believe him, he doesn't believe it, so he doesn't get held accountable to it. He promised to do 4 million vaccinations by the end of March. Waiting. You know, it's Biden, 76, you know, used to, you know, he's not the youngest politician we've ever seen. He has managed to roll out in America, you know, 80% of people are vaccinated. Like, unbelievable. What, they used to call him Sleepy Joe, oh, that's Sleepy Scotty. Like, it's not fair on people with disability. There's a serious edge to this. In terms of how the party's going, listen, I'm the last person in the world to say believe the polls, okay? I think we're going fine. You know, we're in a battle. It's not easy, is it, when you're in opposition in COVID? But really, you know, this government.
Now, I know I set a bad example by asking multiple questions, but it's not compulsory, everybody. The next one is from Sarah Ison from the West Australian.
Thank you for your speech. Just on costing, again, has what you're proposing been costed through shadow cabinet? And a few months ago, you talked about the dangers of, you know, kind of big agenda policies and so on, and then also the dangers of the tiny policy agenda. Do you think now, a little bit closer to a possible election, has Labor got it right? Is it trending too big, too little? What are your thoughts on that?
Listen, what we're proposing with the NDIS is all capable within the existing NDIS budget.
So no more money is needed?
No, not in terms of new programs. But what I would say to you is this. Cancel those mandatory assessment contracts. There's $339 million. Perhaps you might want to stop fighting all the participants to the AAT, then losing. That'll save you tens of millions of dollars. Perhaps stop relying on the big contracting firms and actually hire some direct public servants. And by the way, when I say that, what that means is it drives participants and planners and, you know, out of their wits when you're dealing with labour hire people who are well-meaning, but they don't know the system. Maybe last week they were selling Telstra phones. This week they're working on your family members', you know, needs. If you actually have a trained body of Commonwealth officials, they develop institutional memory. So I think there's plenty of things. And maybe you want to catch a few crooks along the way and perhaps invest in fraud investigators. So I think there are savings in that. Here's another one. Why wait for someone who asks for home modifications to change their shower and keep them waiting for months and months and months till the quote goes out of date? Why ask them to keep getting physios to give you new reports? Like, I tell you now, the bureaucracy and a lot of these decisions, the over-management, they've got a telescope and they've turned it around and they're using it as a microscope. You would not believe some of the stuff which participants get asked to justify within a dollar of their individualised scheme. It's a great irony to me that the party of the individual doesn't cope with individualised planning, and yet seem to have such big government steamroller responses to everything. In terms of the policy agenda, Labor's outlining its policy agenda. I think we're going in exactly the right direction. We're outlining our policies. We've outlined what we would do in jobs. We've outlined, for instance, building sovereign capacity in our vaccinations. So I think we are getting on with business. And I think that when you look at the threadbare nature of the Morrison Government's policy cupboard, I think people are eager for other ideas.
So not too large a policy agenda like last time?
In terms of last time, and I did talk to my therapist before coming here today. Some of it, we probably did have too many ideas. Okay, I get that, but I also recognise that it's not enough to be the opposition. You've got to be the alternative government in terms of policies, and that's exactly what has been happening. And today, within the envelope of the existing NDIS, I think what we've outlined about is putting people with disability at the centre of decision making. And it's my hope one day that a future Labor Minister for Disabilities will be a person with disabilities. And so, there's a lot of things you can do which don't involve spending a lot more money. But the more you respect individuals and let families and individuals control their resources, the further the Commonwealth taxpayer dollar will stretch. Thanks, Sarah.
Tom Connell.
Just one question from me, President. Mr Shorten, just to the recent address from the Prime Minister to a Christian conference, it got a lot of headlines about him doing God's work, laying hands on people. He also spoke about the misuse of social media being the work of the evil one. Don't believe he was referring to Craig Kelly. What were your thoughts, though, on that particular comment referencing social media?
Have you checked that? I think you're probably right, Tom, in all seriousness. Listen, first of all, I want to be very clear that there is a role in public life for people with religious convictions. We are a pluralist society, and so if you have religious values and you seek to practice your religious values within the broad constraints of Australian democratic society, we are pluralist. So that's fine. I don't really think that faith should be an issue. But in terms, and even I go to church, perhaps like most Australians at Easter and Christmas, and less frequently than Mr Morrison, but some people, their faith is public, like Mr Morrison. For some of us, we tend to keep it more private, but that is as it is. I was interested, though, in the reference to the evil one in social media. What I'd like to do is take that fairly unspecified reference, and something I've been thinking about for a while, is that there are some evil things in the internet, and one of them I'm going to just mention is children have too easy access to pornography in this country online. Julie Inman-Grant, the E-Safety Commissioner, has been doing some great work on it. And Tanya Plibersek on our side has been also very active on this question. But I think a lot of parents are oblivious. And, there's a number which I wrote down the other day. But the average age the little Australian boys are exposed to porn online is 13. Well, that's just shocking. We're seeing, and just simply saying to parents, watch what your kids' eyeballs are on the whole time, whilst it's good advice, is a tad unrealistic, as we've created the iPad babysitter. So I think that if Mr Morrison wants to perhaps materialise that general reference to evil, let's make it harder for our Aussie kids to access pornography online. I'm not making a reflection about adults and pornography. I'm not a censor, not going down that path at all. But children shouldn't be getting their sex education from hardcore pornography, and it's something which I know I'm going to take up, and I'm sure others will. And this could be something that Mr Morrison could turn from Sunday service into 7 days a week campaign.
Mark Kenny.
Thanks, Mr Shorten. Mark Kenny from the ANU and the Press Club Board. I want to build on, a theme that Tom Connell and Sarah Ison spoke about, which harks back to your time as opposition leader. Last week we saw world leaders gather together and sign off on, or at least make pledges for very ambitious emissions cuts by 2030. We see numbers like 78% from the UK, 50% from the US, I think 55% from Europe. You took a 45% cut for 2030 to the last election. The world now seems to have come to you. That would actually be modest in that sort of company. Yet the
Thank you, Mark.
The consensus around the place.
Was that the question? No, okay.
Well, I think it was if you want my opinion, I'm going to give it to you. It was a reasonable target. That's what the rest of the world is saying. That's what the science suggests, and that's where I side. But it is not where the current opposition sides. You don't have a 2030 target at all. There was a sort of a general consensus that it was too ambitious, that it was part of that big suite of policies and that it caused much difficulty. I'm wondering, now that the world has come to Labor, is Labor going to be up to that at the next election?
So we've got a perfectly fine climate spokesperson in Chris Bowen, and that's a matter for Anthony and the whole shadow cabinet. Times have changed a bit. I think the global political climate has changed, and I think President Biden in the United States is showing what you can do if you set your mind to something. But having said that, our 2030 target was formed in 2015, and it was based on evidence from then, and it's now, by the next election, going to be 2022. So I'm not sure I would take the same target in a hypothetical sliding doors moment to the next election, because I think that the steepness of trying to achieve that in the remaining time we have between 2022 and 2030 is less than the runway we might have had in 2016 or indeed even 2019. So I don't think you can simply just say we should set the same target, because unfortunately the nation hasn't been on that direction, at least at the Canberra level.
Thank you.
Tegan George.
Mr Shorten, Tegan George from Channel 10. Thank you for your speech. Earlier this year, we saw in response to a federal court ruling, we saw the government come out and say that they would consider changing the NDIS legislation to exclude sexual support services. The minister at the time, I think, said it was not in line with community expectations for money to be spent on that. Do you agree with Minister Robert on that point, or would you fight to ensure that specialised sex work services remain an approved therapy?
This was a federal court case based on one matter where one participant, due to her impairment, needed some services. Stuart Robert, with that remarkably trademark enthusiasm, out of 433,000 participants, focused on this one case about a participant receiving sexual therapy. Now, whilst I admire his attention to the detail of one claim, I did ponder at the time, what else does Stuart Robert follow in the NDIS other than this matter? And what I now realise is that it was a stalking horse. What they want to do is the minister and the agency want to have the power to wind back the range of matters that people can seek funding on. Now, ultimately, do I think that service is sustainable? Maybe not, no. But what I don't accept is that the government just really wants to use a couple of examples, cherry pick one or two examples out of 433,000 participants and justify wholesale cuts to the system. Let's call a spade a spade. Stewie was looking at this, he said, well, this is outrageous, and I can turn my outrage on one issue into a blanket case to take the steamroller to the whole system. And I'm not buying that. So yeah, he might be right on that particular point. But what he's not right on is making 433,000 people reapply. He's not right in eliminating states and territories from decision making. He's not right in taking away the role of treating every allied health professional currently treating a person with a disability as suspicious and somehow captured by the participant and can't trust their report. You've got to get a stranger in to interview the person. So excuse me for being a little sceptical that the thing which seemed to animate Stuart Robert most was this one federal court case.
Jade McMillan.
I'm sure, though, it's not the only person who requires these services. So are you saying you wouldn't?
Well, I'm saying that's the only case I'm aware of.
So you don't believe it should be an approved therapy?
No, I accept in the debate that Australians probably wouldn't think that was appropriate. But what I don't accept is the motivations of Mr Roberts.
If I could just get a further elaboration, should it be the minister who's making the calls on that?
No, we should have guidelines set out in the Act, and it should be, and if you want to change guidelines, it should be by legislation, not just by the minister.
Jade McMillan.
Jade McMillan from the ABC.
Hi, Jane.
Linda Reynolds has only recently taken over as the Minister for the NDIS, but what do you make of at least the direction she appears to be taking the portfolio in so far? And have you reached out to her? Is there a constructive role that Labor can play given the importance of this area?
I'm sure she can be very constructive. Listen, she has had her own political difficulties of late, and that's just a matter of record. I think she could redeem her reputation. But by taking Stuart Roberts' stink bomb and perpetuating that, I don't think is the way to do it. Let's be straight here. She should cancel the contracts. It's one thing to say, hey, I'm going to listen to everyone. That's a sensible measure, and I applaud that. It's nothing to say we will wait to a major trial before we go to the next step, should we do something. But how on earth, people, Can you say, I'm going to wait for a major test, a trial of an idea to see if we should do it, but have already issued $339 million of taxpayers' money to implement it? Like, you can't. It's a bit like building the hangman's scaffold before you've had the trial. The verdict's in. So I think she needs to cancel the contracts. I do think she needs to address, as a matter of immediate priority, how the NDIA can work better with the Safeguards Commission to identify, when people do their initial participant interview, people who might be particularly vulnerable, so we can avoid Anne-Marie Smith, David Harris, Liam Danaher matters happening again. I think that if she took some of the 5 points I've outlined, that would be a good start to building trust, because at the moment, just being not Stuart Robert, whilst that in itself is a relief for some people, isn't actually enough to say that you're doing a good job as the minister. But, you know, she's Minister number 7, so to the extent she can be no worse than Minister number 6, good. But to the extent that if that's the limit of national ambition in this country, that's bad.
Nick Stewart.
Thanks, Mr. Shorten. Just one question, 3 parts. The first part is you identified the amount that's lost to fraud each year. What rough figure do you think that is? How many million, billion, 100 million? Secondly, what is the underspend on disability care? You've identified the fact that the current government is not spending enough. What is it? Presumably it's somewhere between 20 and 50 billion. Roughly, what do you think that is? And thirdly, how do you keep really valuable Australian workers in the system? A physiotherapist gets paid a certain amount per service. What makes them, after they've done 5 years or 10 years of physiotherapy, how do you reflect the fact that their physiotherapy is actually worth more than when they first began giving the service?
Thanks, Stuart, for me giving a whole other talk. Listen, on the fraud, John Higgins was the former AFP police officer of some long standing who became a fraud investigator. He is the person who said to me he was told that they could accept up to a 10% seepage rate. We do see that when I spoke with John last year, that their fraud squad, their fraud investigation teams, the 2 of them weren't even properly staffed. He explained to me that there were cost-cutting measures which just made it very hard to do their job. They recently, with the AFP, did have some success in shutting down a bunch of crooks, but I'm going to go with the people at the front line who've got a view about this, not just government press releases. In terms of underspend, the number which probably taxes me the most is people get a certain package. You know, let's call it for mathematical sake, $50,000. What is happening is the average spend is 70% of that. In other words, because the system isn't working properly, even if you're allocated resources, you can't use them. In Tasmania, where there's a state election this Saturday, which Beck White is running, and she's made health the #1 issue in that election, there are an insufficient number of physiotherapists in Tasmania. So effectively, because the NDIS doesn't have a workforce plan, because the government doesn't have a workforce plan in health in Tasmania, Tasmanians are getting a second-class NDIS. So there's an underspend of money which people are allocated but they can't actually spend. That's the thing which most taxes me. I said earlier, I don't accept the figure that John Walsh put. That was based on data from the Productivity Commission before that report, so that's a decade old. I think there are efficiencies which can be made in the scheme. Also, when we talk about cost, I met a lady, incidentally, she was in northern Tasmania. She has a nervous condition which gradually sees her nerves being eaten away. She graphically said to me, in the end, she'll just be a head. She wanted a shower, and she wanted which to suit her, and she wanted a lounge room to suit her. She's a brave lady. Fantastic. Her and her partner, fantastic people. They had to go through months and months and months arguing for some of the modifications. They eventually got it. This lady doesn't have time. And then they had to do the next set of mods. I forget whether or not she got the living room and then had to fight for the shower. No, I think initially she got the shower, but she had been bathing in a bucket of water. And the NDIA is asking for reports. I tell you how I'd save money. If you've got urgent home modifications, you put a deadline on the agency. and just say, if at a certain number of days you haven't made a decision, it's deemed accepted. That's where I think the inefficiency and the understanding. How on earth are you saving money? When Liam Danaher wanted that seizure mattress, you could say that they had an underspend. You could say they saved money on the mattress. The Danaher family might care to disagree. They do. In terms of our workers in the system, I think that, and this is where the NDIA surprised me. I met with the NDIA and I said, what's your plan on workforce? And they sort of said to me, it's not our job, we're the payment system. The NDIA is the big dog of disability. It's got over $20 billion. When you're spending $20 billion of taxpayer money, surely you've got to take an interest in the market into which you're investing it. And that doesn't mean just having a price guide of 950 items, how much a catheter is or how much a tyre on a wheelchair is. It's about thinking about the workforce of the future. I'm incredibly proud. I went on LinkedIn and I saw that, type in NDIS, there's about 17,000 people who have NDIS or local coordinators in their titles. That didn't exist 10 years ago. So something good is happening as well as something bad. And I make that point. There's a lot of good things, there's a lot of good people. But they have no plan for workforce. The other thing which I think the government's got to do is get over its ideological hassle about the minimum award rates. You know, the unions have a point of view. They should sit down and talk to them on a regular basis. They should sit down with TAFE, with unions, with states and territories. I want young people to think that disability is a career not just based on emotional commitment, but based on the fact that one day you might be able to afford a mortgage. So I think the NDIA needs to not just allow thin markets to exist and lack of service provision, but lead. And that's what I also think the government should do, lead, not follow. Thank you.
We're right on time. This is the last question from Astrid Watts.
Hi Bill, thank you very much. I'm a student journalist with 9+ disabilities. Every day I fight the stigma attached to those disabilities. My question to you is, do you feel there is room within the NDIS and the NDIA to promote an awareness of invisible illnesses? Every single one of my disabilities are invisible illnesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just nice to meet you, Astrid, and I'm glad you asked that question. And that question really lets me bring it back to where it all started. Impairment is a fact of life. You get it at birth. You could, when your little beautiful child doesn't develop at 12 or 24 months the way you hoped. You could acquire it through ageing. The great American poet, laureate, Robert Frost, talking about his son. They're the shafts of fate, but they shouldn't define you. So I think the nation as a whole needs to do more on disability, not just government. I think we all need to be better employers of people with disability. I think we need to recognise the NDIS only goes to the most people with the profound and severe disabilities, but there's a lot more out there. We treat people on the DSP as forgotten. Here, you get your pension, just sit there till you die or sit there till you turn 65, 67. So I think that the nation needs to do more. Having said that, I see nothing wrong with the government having affirmative action hiring policies. I see nothing wrong with encouraging employers with subsidies. I see nothing wrong with the better presentation of people with disability in the media. Let's just put them in the media to begin with and make them part of our shows and our content, not make it something different. So I think that the NDIA could do all of that too. Now, it does some things. And I just want to say to all those NDIA staff who might be feeling a bit beleaguered, it's not you who are the problem. It's what I think is a very senior level technocratic management who fail to understand the dream of the NDIA, and ministers who are disinterested or just treat the NDIS as a ATM. So, yeah, I think they can do more. I think we can do more as a nation. A national disability strategy, and that's something I'd encourage the federal government to dust off. It's everything. It's from access to this building, it's to the built environment of our residential homes, it's to the proper funding and mainstream schooling of special education. There's a state role here. I'd say to the Tasmanian Liberal government, lift your taxi voucher system, which you cut, because if you can't leave your home, you can't exercise a lot of your rights. But anyway, it's a whole process, Astrid, and thank you for reminding us what really matters, people.
Not a problem. I'll just add as well, I've been rejected for the NDIS.
Well, not everyone's going to get the NDIS. I'm sorry that you have, and obviously see us and we'll see, no doubt you'll appeal it. But not everyone will get the NDIS, I'm not saying that. Yeah. but I'm saying that every person with a disability just deserves an opportunity. It's not impairment that defines you. It's a lack of money, lack of power, and it's the barriers the community put in your path. And that's what we want to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Well, before getting everybody to thank you, Mr Shorten, could we just ask whether you'd be prepared to take part in a debate during the next election campaign against your coalition counterpart?
No problems. We get all 7 of them.
Please thank Bill Shorten.
I'll still be outnumbered.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to ABC News. I'm Lorna Dunkley. These are the top stories. A Melbourne man who filmed a dying police officer on the side of Melbourne's Eastern Freeway may only spend a few more days in prison. Richard Pusey has been sentenced to 10 months in jail, but may be released next week, having already served 296 days behind bars. The 42-year-old was also put on a 2-year good behaviour bond, given a $1,000 fine and had his licence suspended for 2 years. The federal opposition has criticised the government's response to Australians stranded in India. More than 9,000 Australians remain stranded in the country after the government temporarily suspended flights due to a surge in new infections. Opposition leader Anthony Albanese says Australian citizens should have been brought back from India months ago. Olympic athletes will be required to spend 14 days in hotel quarantine when they return from Tokyo. More than 2,000 athletes and their support staff will be given early access to either the Pfizer or AstraZeneca vaccine ahead of the Games. But the Sports Minister, Richard Colbeck, says the athletes will still be subject to quarantine arrangements. And survivors of the stolen generation in the Northern Territory are suing the federal government. The class action lawsuit will seek compensation for the hurt and trauma experienced and the loss of culture and connection to country. So, as I just mentioned, the federal opposition has criticised the government for falling behind on repatriation targets. More than 9,000 Australians remain stranded in India after the government temporarily suspended flights due to a surge in new COVID infections. Labor leader Anthony Albanese says the government has an obligation to Australian citizens.
We need to make sure that we prioritise getting Australians home. And it's understandable, these border closures, given what has occurred in India. The real question is, why weren't these Australians brought home when Scott Morrison said he would? He told these Australians that they'd be home before Christmas, didn't put in place the measures that were available. I called now some 10 months ago, for example, for the use of the VIP fleet. That would have been appropriate to bring people home from India who wanted to get home. But that wasn't done by the federal government. And I feel greatly for those people who are stranded in India as Australian citizens, and also for their families back here as well, many of whom are distressed. It's more than 6 months since I held a press conference in a backyard in Wentworthville in Sydney with a man who couldn't get his wife home at that time. And the fact is that the federal government's response in terms of its obligation to Australian citizens has not been good enough.
Anthony Albanese there. Well, we are standing by to hear from the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, within the next hour. He's in Darwin. He's making a defence announcement. We'll bring that news conference to you live here on the News Channel when it begins. The WA government is injecting extra resources into its vaccination rollout to boost lagging numbers in the state. Additional clinics will begin operating from next month, including a hub at Perth Airport. 4 new cases of COVID-19 were detected overnight. All are returned travellers in hotel quarantine.
Getting West Australians and Australians more generally vaccinated is incredibly important for the health and well-being of all Australians. Today we're here at the Claremont Mass Vaccination Centre. It's open for over 70s. I'd encourage everyone to make an appointment and come and get vaccinated. There is a clinic at the Perth Airport and it is also available for over 70s and so we are seeking people to come and get vaccinated in that category as soon as possible. There's a range of other clinics around Western Australia for people in 1A and 1B currently operational, and as you know, that's who we've vaccinated so far. But the key to the key to ensuring that we have strong health outcomes in the long-term future is to ensure that West Australians get vaccinated. So as of May 3, over 50s will be able to be vaccinated, and that's next Monday. So that'll be available here at Claremont at the airport. We'll be opening mass vaccination clinic in Joondalup and also one in the area around Kwinana. So there'll be a range of them across Perth. As of May 17, GPs, eligible GPs all over the state, will be able to vaccinate people over 50, and that means all over regional WA as well. So the vaccine program is rolling out, and we're keen to get as many people vaccinated as soon as we possibly can to ensure that those people in the more vulnerable age groups are covered and their lives and their welfare is made safer.
Mark McGowan speaking earlier. The Commonwealth Ombudsman has found that Australian Capital Territory Police have a cavalier approach to exercising telecommunications data powers. The Ombudsman has been investigating ACT Policing's use of location pings from mobile phones. It found that between 2015 and 2019, only 9 out of more than 1,700 individual accesses to data were fully compliant with the law. 8 recommendations have been made to police, all of which have been accepted. Facebook's been accused of profiling teenagers in order to target them with alcohol, vaping and gambling advertisements. The research was carried out by Reset Australia, a lobby group that monitors big tech. Chris Cooper from Reset says these findings are concerning.
We wanted to explore if Facebook treats teenagers' data differently to adults. So we set up an ad account and then used Facebook's ad platform to see what profiles were available that we could potentially target ads to teenagers based around. And what we found was that Facebook sells access to profiles, to teenage profiles, based on a series of questionable interests, such as alcohol, gambling, smoking, and more. I mean, this is where the harms of excessive data collection and surveillance that Facebook does across the internet of all of us, this is where those harms really manifest and where the rubber hits the road. And we should be really concerned about this, but we should really be asking the question, not only do we feel comfortable that 13-year-olds can be targeted based off interests, such as we've mentioned, by advertisers without oversight. But really, are we comfortable with young people's data being collected for these purposes at all? And that's why we think it's important that we look to a new data code, such as being proposed and legislated in the UK and in Ireland, that protects children's and young people's data and gives them the maximum level of privacy protection. There's no meaningful way for any of us, let alone young people, to opt out of the data tracking that happens by big tech companies like Facebook. This business model is built on the collection of data of all of us, and it makes billionaires. I mean, this is one of the biggest, richest companies in the world, and it's based off their ability to track and surveil and then target all of us with ads. And they do that with very little oversight and very little controls. We really don't understand the long-term effects of this kind of data harvesting. And that's why there should just be basic levels of protection. And that should really start with young people. But this should open up a conversation for all of us about how we feel around the data collection of the way that Facebook does that. And we talk to young people, and overwhelmingly they were really concerned about this. They were uncomfortable by the level of data collection that was happening in the first place,